Hi,
Nice to
Claire.
meet
How are
you.
you?
Good,
I'm
thanks.
Adam.
Hi, Adam.
Moray. Hi.
Hi, nice to meet you. Great. How's everything going over there?
We are just starting harvest for a couple of our clients. We started picking on Monday, so 2 days ago. We picked yesterday and today.
Excellent. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me. I'm really excited
Happy.
to learn a bit more about your wines. So I tasted them a few days ago. I have 3 of your Clarice wines and 3 of your Beau Marchais.
Yes.
And I have them here with me as well. And it would be nice to taste maybe like 1 or 2 of each.
I've got wines here as well. So a couple of them. So we can definitely do that.
Yeah, great. So maybe you could tell me a little bit more about both projects. Maybe we can start with Clarice.
Yes.
They're both quite recent, right?
They are. So Clarice was my grandmother. That's named after her. She was born in 1896, and actually today's her wedding anniversary. She would have been married 110 years, I guess. She got married when she was 15. She eloped. But I always thought the fact that she took a chance, ran away with a guy, and they ended up being married 67 years, and that led to me and all that. Taking that chance in life was something that really inspired me to start this venture. So I mean, my background is I started Siduri Wines back in 1994 with $24,000, made 107 cases. 6 years ago, I sold that to Jackson Family, and I still work with them. I still consult some with them. But I wanted to start something over again, something smaller, something that was a good bit more hands-on kind of way. And really what I wanted to do was to go to 2 vineyards, primarily the Gary's Vineyard and the Rosella's Vineyard. And there are 2 vineyards that I've worked with since the very start of both of those vineyards, and treat them differently than I did at Siduri. Siduri was definitely at a time period in California where you made some big, rich style Pinot Noirs. What I wanted to do here was to take a more hands-off approach, be very involved in the vineyard, lease the acreage, have the opportunity to go through and work with Gary Francione and Mark Pizzoni and do a lot of the work together in the vineyard, decide on shoot thinning, leaf pulling, how much crop there was going to be, and then bring in the wine, do a lot of whole cluster. So these wines in 2019, they're about 75%, 70 to 75% whole cluster. And really, other than that, not do any additions. So there is no yeast added to this, no malolactic bacteria. Things just kind of go on their own, but it's getting really great fruit. The other key is I take 2 disparate sections in each of the vineyards. So like the Gary's Vineyard that I have here, there is a upper section and a lower section, 2 very different rootstocks. They usually ripen 10 days to 2 weeks apart. Right now in the vineyard, one of them is at this year is at like 19 and a half bricks. The other one is at 17 and a half bricks. So they're a decent bit apart, but I sample them together and I ferment them together. I pick them together and I ferment them together. So what you get there is the overall vineyard is ripe, those 2 sections, but some of it's overripe, some of it's underripe, which is kind of like a purposeful field blend in some ways.
So you pick them all at the same time, and then
I do, and ferment them together all in one vessel. Really, as I said, the key there is if the whole is ripe, then that's what I am interested in. You know, the overall flavor impression is that the grapes, the juice is ripe, but what you're getting is not everything being perfectly ripe. Some of it's a little underripe, some of it's a little overripe, and I think that hopefully makes a more complex and interesting combination in that way.
And do you think Pinot Noir is a variety that's more suited to that type of like experimentation, let's call it?
I think two things there. I think older vines help. I mean, mature vines, they don't have to be old, but I think with very young vines, what you get is a higher sugar that the bricks will get ahead of the flavors, and you aren't really able to do that kind of combination of picking in the same way. It's an old tradition here in California with really, really old vines, Zinfandel and some of those field blends, that people would do that and they would say, let's put in a little bit of Petit Syrah for some color, uh, maybe a little bit of Mourvedre for a little more earthy character. Zin or Carignan will preserve some acid, and they would do field blends like that. With Pinot, we haven't done that in California. We have planted the rows 1 through 10 are clone 115, rows 11 through 21 are clone 828, and we just keep them very distinct and very separate. So I think it works well with a mature vineyard, this type of experimentation, a mature vineyard that well, and that no section is going to get, I mean, they're going to be different from one another, but a heat spike is not going to push one section much faster than the other because they have good roots established and good access to water. And I think that really helps in this particular case to work well. But I'm fortunate also, I've worked with this vineyard, the Gary's Vineyard, since 1999. I was there when it was planted in 1997. And so it's got some, I've seen it grow up, and I kind of know how to treat it in that case.
I was wondering, because you pick them all at different levels of ripeness, maybe, is there ever a risk of having unripe stems because you do so much whole bunch pressing? That's quite important.
Yeah, and so I've done Clarice now since 2017, so 17, 18, and 19. And 17 was a very hot year, and I only did 50 to 55% whole cluster. 18 was a long, cool growing season, and I did closer to 80-ish% whole cluster. In 19, I backed it down a little bit to that 70% range. That's still, all of those numbers are fairly high and fairly unusual for the San Lucia Highlands. You're not finding a lot of people that are doing that much whole bunch fermentation in that part of Monterey County. I think that's a mistake. I think there are ample reasons why it makes sense to do it there. But yeah, there is a risk in doing that you're going to get that you could have. I mean, that's kind of my nightmare. That's what keeps me up at nights, is that I'm going to make this decision and going to screw it up and have an overly stemmy wine, because I think that's a problem. I mean, it's funny, if a lot of winemakers who really like whole cluster don't feel like that's a problem, but I do. I think if you taste a wine and immediately say, boy, this tastes a lot like stems, then maybe you have made an incorrect selection. It's much the same as if you tasted a wine and said, this tastes like a lot of oak. Well, then you've over oaked it, So, I mean, anything that stands out too much like that, I think, can be a problem. One of the things I have found on stem ripeness is it has to do with length of hang time and does not correlate with sugar maturity necessarily. So in a hot year where you have a big heat spike, you can get higher sugars much faster than you get stem ripeness. So actually, cooler vintages are better years to do whole cluster, and warmer vintages sometimes are really problematic years.
I see. So that's why in 2017 you dialed it back down to about 50%.
Correct. Yeah, because in 2017 we had more days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, over 40 Celsius more or less, than we did in 18 and 19 combined. Wow. So 17 was a much warmer year, and particularly the Labor Day, right at that. If it gets really warm, but it's May or June, I don't know that matters, when the shoots are only so far up, and I don't know that affects it. But once you actually have fruit on the vine, and particularly once fruit has gone through variation, I think those heat spikes can really affect things.
Yeah. And I was also curious, how do you find the fruit in Monterey compared to further up in California where you made Siduri?
Yeah, so the fruit in Monterey tends to be higher in acid, lower in pH. I think what you get in the San Lucia Highlands is a really interesting phenomena. It opens up directly to Monterey Bay. And when the inland valley, the next valley over from the Salinas Valley, where the San Lucia Highlands is, the next valley over, when it warms up, it really acts almost like a vacuum cleaner and pulls in the fog and particularly the wind off of Monterey Bay. So usually the coolest part of the day, or the hottest part of the day, is about 1 or 1:30 in the afternoon. And then it starts to go down after that. So you get a much longer hang time because you don't have those really high midday, mid-afternoon temperatures most years.
So would that make it sort of safer to have west-facing vineyards as well if it doesn't retain the heat so much?
It would. I mean, that would work for westward-facing vineyards. It could, but you don't have many of those in the San Lucias because of the way the particular hills run. This is on the westward side of a valley, and so being on the westward side, most of the vineyards are facing more east. What it does allow you to do by having that wind and that long hang time, because you keep very good levels of acidity and you retain very low pHs. You know, when you do a lot of whole bunch, you get a bump usually in your pH. You'll end up being, it makes the wine higher pH, lower strength of acidity because of the potassium in the stems. And so the fact that we come in at such great levels of acidity to begin with, I actually think that's one of the reasons why it's a really good area in a lot of ways to do whole cluster.
Right. Yeah. So I particularly liked your Gary's Vineyard. Is there any difference between how you make that and the Rosella's vineyards?
Yeah, I mean, there was a little adjustment as far as the percentage of whole cluster, but not tremendously so. The Gary's comes in slightly earlier. It always buds out a little bit earlier. It's 2 miles further south, 2 miles further away from the bay. So it's slightly warmer. What I think makes the difference in the Gary's is the vineyard has a good bit more, and particularly for the San Lucia Highlands, an unusually amount more of rocks in the soil. Most of it is more of like a sandy loam in the area, but Gary's has much more. You'll just notice it throughout the vineyard. I can even send you a picture at some point in time. Much more rocky soil than the others. And I think that really kind of changes the character of the wine.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm getting a lot of like minerality, but also some iodine and some even sea urchin notes, which sounds very strange. It's beautiful.
I noticed that in your notes. I saw your notes this morning online on the wine, and I thought it was a fascinating note, and I liked that quite a bit.
Yeah, it's very complex. It's very perfumed.
And honestly, that's the greatest compliment you could pay me. I'm kind of doing this backwards in some ways. When I was young, I should have made wines that really needed to age, and because I would be around for it. And now that I'm old, I should make wines that drink really good right off the bat. But I think I've gotten to a point where I am trying to make wines that are going to have a longer lifespan, more complexity, and less just big forward California fruit character to them.
Yeah, completely. Amazing. Let's move on to Beau Marchais, because that's a very different style.
Completely and totally different, and in all honesty, not my style as much as it is Philippe Cambie's style. You know, and I don't know, have you had the opportunity to meet Philippe? Or I'm sure you've had some of his wines, but Philippe's a brilliant winemaker. He's become a really good friend as well, specializing in Grenache, truly, more than anything else. Philippe lives in the town of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and he works with 81 other wineries around the world, including, I mean, a lot in the south of France, but he's also got people that he works with in Priorat, Macedonia, Washington State, works with Justin Smith down in Paso Robles.
All of which are based around Grenache.
Yes, all of them are based around Grenache. A couple of them, like up in Washington State, it's Syrah, a little more focused than Grenache, but there's Grenache in the blend. With Justin Smith, it's more Zinfandel in some ways, but there's Grenache in the blend. So um, it's all in that Southern Rhone end of things. Although I don't know, Zin doesn't really count as Southern Rhone, but I don't know, it tastes like it to me. It fits in some ways to that profile. But when you go to Chateauneuf, there are a couple of things that I have found fascinating. Visiting all of the wineries, they always tell you that out of all of the different red grape types in Chateauneuf, that they consider Grenache to be the Pinot Noir of those grape types. So the fact that kind of sparked my interest in hearing that, given the Pinot's kind of what I've devoted my winemaking life to. And then secondly, if you go, and it was written in a book by Remington Norman on Chateauneuf du Pape, he talks about going through the cellar books, primarily at the co-op, but in several other estates as well. And through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even into the very early 80s, over half the Grenache grown in Chateauneuf was sold to domains in Burgundy to blend in crappier years. I mean, not legally, but it happens. In California, we always get accused of blending in Syrah into our Pinot because they can be darker and bigger. And I, in honesty, have tried it in the lab. Let me see a little bit. And it's got to be pretty uninteresting Syrah to make that work. If the Syrah's got any of that peppery character, any of that, it takes over and you don't really have that opportunity. But Grenache, if you think about it, more red fruited, but definitely in a bigger, riper style, that's what you could blend in a cold year into Burgundy that would not change the character too much. So those two factors were things that I had in my mind. And then I was having dinner at Philippe's house in Chateauneuf, and we were a few bottles in, along with a friend of mine, Mike Officer, who owns Carlisle Winery. And we were drinking and tasting. And at one point, Philippe said, "I've always dreamed of making Pinot Noir." And I love that. I thought that was fascinating. Philippe could have said, "I think I could do well with it." He could have said, "I could make money doing it." But instead he said, "I've always dreamed of that." So when I returned to the United States, I dropped him an email and of course thanked him for the dinner at his house, and then said, "You mentioned that you'd always dreamed of making Pinot. Would you consider doing it with me?" And he said, "I would love to do that." So that's how the joint venture came about. The wine is made entirely. I shepherd the grapes. I look at them. Obviously, he's not here for the harvest. I'll send him pictures. But if there's something going wrong in a tank, I can take care of that. But really, the style and the winemaking direction is at Philippe's choosing there. He picks a bit riper than I do for the Clarice wines. Does not use much whole cluster. I mean, some of these have 15%, 20%, but nothing. I mean, enough for a little interest, but nothing extraordinary there.
How does that compare to how he handles Grenache and Chateauneuf?
So Grenache, he'll destem in virtually every case. I do know a couple of places he consults for. So there are really a couple of wineries. Chateau Valdoux is one of them, and Clos Saint Jean. There are two that are, and then he has his own label as well, Halos de Jupiter. But those three are the ones where he's fully and truly in charge of the wine. One of the great things about Philippe as a consultant is if he came to you and you have some land in Chateauneuf and you said, "I really like this old school style with more whole cluster and all of that," if you had a good relationship, he'd be willing to make wine more in your style. So I don't want to put Philippe too much into saying he's all this way, all that way, but given his own choices, he's going to do very little whole cluster. He's going to pick Grenache very ripe. Not much in the way of new oak. That is different on Pinot. That is the one thing that I would tell you that I really look at and see very different in his making of Grenache in Chateauneuf and his making of Pinot is that he likes new oak on Pinot. But in the Grenache, I mean, it's not uncommon, like at Clos Saint Jean, for it to stay in the Grenache portion of a Chateauneuf blend to stay in concrete the whole time. So it's not, he's not doing oak on that. A long time on the skins, long maceration. We are about 48 days on the skins, which I've never made Pinot at that length before. I mean, it's pretty unusual. He has a proprietary enzyme that he uses that helps extract more without really extracting too much in the way of tannins. I mean, it's just and at the end, after fermentation is finished, every other day, we pump out of the bottom valve, go over the top, but into the tank. So there's no oxygen brought in, but it pushes the skins back up off the floor, back into suspension in the wine, which is something I haven't done before either. So, I mean, to me, it's fascinating because I've made Pinot since '94, and this has caused me to look at the grape in a completely different way than I've ever looked at it before.
And how do you feel about this style? Because it's, the wines are over 15% in alcohol. They are balanced because they're so concentrated, and it makes sense. If you macerate them for so long, they have that power as well. So they stand up to the oak. They are spicy, smoky, but they're balanced. But how do you feel about such a big style of Pinot Noir at such a high alcohol level?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. So first of all, I tell this to people all the time. I am completely clueless as to how these wines are going to age. I mean, I have no idea what the lifespan of them. If a wine ages on concentration, these are going to age very well. These have more tannin than a lot of Pinot have, but the acidity is not quite as high. So from an age-worthy point of view, I have no idea if these are going to make old bones or not. And I'm a big believer that, I taste a lot of wine, you taste a lot of wine. We can guess how long a wine's going to age. But the way I know that Heights Martha's Cabernet ages for a long time is I can go buy a bottle of 1974 and it's still drinking well, kind of thing. So you have to have some track record, and there's not a lot of track record yet. Here with these. I don't have any issue with the style per se. It's not the style. I mean, if this is the style I wanted to make for Clarice, then that's what I would do. But I have, over the years in Burgundy, I mean, Richard Olney's book about Romani Conti, he talks about how they said decent Pinot is 11 to 12% alcohol. Good Pinot is 12 to 13. Very good is 13 to 14. And great Pinot is 14 and a half, 15, 15 and a half, and 16% alcohol. That was back in a day where two things, they would short prune so much. So the yields at DRC, which are tiny anyhow, were even smaller back then. And then secondly, they didn't have the ability to make the wine stable as much through sulfur and that kind of thing. This was in the 1860s. So a bigger, higher alcohol wine was a more stable wine for transporting and that kind of thing. So I think historically, while this isn't what we think of as far as Pinot goes, it depends on how far you go back in history to take a look at it. There was a guy named, an enologist named Guy Accad, for some period of time in Burgundy that added huge amounts of sulfur right off the bat. And he made very big, dark wines. That was in the late 80s, basically. So I think it is a style that is not something I'm used to. It's not something that I've seen before or seen done before. But I don't know that it is out of the historical norm for Burgundy to do something weird. And I don't know that for Pinot, this is necessarily... it's not what is in fashion these days, but I don't know that matters to me necessarily.
I think it will be very interesting to see how it's going to age if it's slightly lower in acidity, but it's so muscular in terms of the tannins. I even think they would taste better in a year or two than they do now.
And I think that's entirely the case, only from the point of view of when I first bottled these. So these were bottled in August of 2020. they didn't remind me of Pinot, quite frankly. I mean, when I tasted them in a bottle, I'm like, this is not Pinot, but I don't know what, I mean, it's not quite Chateauneuf Grenache either, but it's some place.
But it has some of that smoky, spicy element to it.
Yes, yes. I think now when I taste them, they taste to me like more like very, very big Pinot than they did in August, I guess. And so if that makes any sense, they are more, they're heading in a direction that remind me a little more of Pinot in some ways.
Right. So I have the Clos Pepe West and East
West.
and the Soberanas. In my glass I have the West right now, which I personally quite liked. What do you do anything different between all of them? Obviously, I assume one is west facing, one is east facing, or is that?
Yes, yes. So on the west and the east. So Clos Pepe is a vineyard I've been working with under Siduri primarily since 2000. Very first crop there as well. The vineyard does have, I get three sections. I get a section that is the far eastern portion, eastward facing. That's clone 115. I get Pommard that is right in the middle. And I get the westward facing section, which is 667 clone. Quite frankly, we didn't intend to make an east and a west when we first made this. The fruit came in and it was an amount that really required 2 tanks. And I'm like, okay, let me put the Pommard from the middle in each of the tanks and then put the 667 from the west in one tank and the 115 from the east in the other tank with the Pommard. And then we barreled them down and pressed off. And I still remember thinking these wines are pretty different. And then Philippe and I were blending in February of 2020, and we're tasting. It was the last time we got to see each other up until last month, but at least in person due to COVID. Having to blend remotely is quite the challenge, as you can imagine. We were tasting it, and we kept trying to blend these east and west sections together to make a harmonious wine, because we only wanted to make one Clos Pepe and one Soberanas. And it turned out that we were not able ever to do that, that they were just too different and they never worked together. And so it was Philippe's idea. And he said, let's just bottle them as separate wines.
And with the different clones that you planted on the east and the west, did you choose that based on the terroir, like the soils or the aspect, or was it just try this parcel with this clone and this other parcel?
To some extent, but I don't know that it was fully correct in some ways. So the 667 we put on the westward facing side because 667 is usually an earlier ripener, and we made the assumption that being facing west directly into the wind that comes off the ocean, it was cooler, and so that way it would get ripe. But it turned out that it not only does it get ripe, it gets very ripe because the yields are so low there on that side, while on the 115, the yields are somewhat higher. I mean, these yields are still all particularly low in that area, but the Santa Lucia has higher yields generally than Santa Rita Hills. But that other side, so I would look at it and say, yes, we did it for a certain reason and it's worked out, but the reasons we did it, it didn't turn out that way. We made a mistake, I guess you could say, but sometimes you get lucky in your mistakes.
Having made this, I mean, you are basically an expert in Pinot Noir. You've been making it for decades. Have you learnt anything from making it in a different style, in a more of a Grenache style? Is there anything you've like taken from that you would think, oh, actually, this should be Pinot Noir?
There are a few things. There. But I mean, to be fair, I think this is going to take a few years to see if what I learned is, we only get to make wine once a year. And so lessons learned are sometimes slower than in our daily lives where, I can screw up today and screw up tomorrow. And then, I could learn lessons faster in some ways there. A couple things, though. I think that we often say, at least here in the States, there's one way within of making Pinot Noir. You only kind of do it this way. You only kind of do it that way. I think there are probably other ways to do it. You avoid oxygen. You do this. You do that. I mean, it's. I think Pinot Noir is a bit more malleable in some ways than some people think it is. That we can do a little bit more with it. I think. I think the other aspect of it, quite frankly, is there are, and this will be less for Clarice, but what I'm doing, but there is this one enzyme that Philippe uses that helps release polysaccharides from the skins and helps kind of give a sweeter mouthfeel. It doesn't give any residual sugar to it, but it gives you a sweeter mouthfeel to the wine. And that's something that I think I will be playing with. I have a couple of wines that I am making for some clients that are more in the $20-ish, $25. I mean, a very reasonable price point. I mean, I really don't like some of the bigger, sweeter Mayomi kind of California Pinots. I mean, I just find those to be problematic. I don't mind the sweet fruit. I just don't want truly residual sugar in the wine. And I think this might be a way to achieve some of that without kind of giving in to that sweetness.
So having the right flavors, but completely fermenting all of the sugars.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be playing with some of that this year.
Which region for Pinot Noir in California gets you the most excited?
Well, so I've made Pinot from Oregon all the way down to Santa Rita Hills over the years, and I certainly could have chosen any other areas to go to for Clarice. I chose Santa Lucia Highlands because I do think, for several reasons, I think the area is an extremely good area. I think the only thing that can limit it sometimes is it's weird to say this, the farming mentality. There are people who are, many people there who are fantastic farmers, but almost all of them farm not only grapes, but they farm row crops as well. That their families have been growing lettuce or asparagus or whatever for quite some time, artichokes. I think farming those is a different mentality than farming grapevines. You don't look at a field of asparagus and say, if I remove some of the asparagus, the other asparagus are going to be better. Well, you do that with grapes all the time. You remove certain clusters on short shoots or green clusters. You do a green harvest. I think the reason that I think there's a myriad of fascinating and incredibly, could be incredibly great sites there. I just think sometimes the farming needs to catch up to that. So I'm really encouraged about that area. And I think it has the potential to make incredibly great Pinot over the long term, because it's remaining cool. If anything, it's staying, as we're dealing with some warming up in certain areas, it's staying very, very cool there. The other areas that I really think are fascinating, I do like the Santa Rita Hills. I think there's some great stuff there. But I think the true Sonoma Coast also has some real potential. I think Sonoma Coast is, it's a big area. It's an ill-defined area sometimes. Some of Sonoma Coast is actually on the east side of the highway, of the main highway 101. If you're on the east side of the highway, how are you Sonoma Coast? But some of the true areas out far west here in Sonoma County, I think have some incredible potential to make some fascinating wine. So those are kind of the three areas that I would look at and feel really good about.
Excellent.
Well, thank you for the time. Thanks for tasting the wines, and I really appreciate your thoughts
for sharing all of your insight and thoughts about these wines. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.